So last week we went through and we created a class and we added it to this command line application that we were doing. The class was to model a student or a user. If you want to add a class to your project, you would go up, you right click on the project, you go down to add, and then you have some choices. You can add an item. An item just gives you an item template dialog, and you get a selection of all kinds of different things. You can add a class, you can add an interface, you can add a Windows form, you can add a user control, and you may be thinking, well, why would I add a Windows form to a command line application? You'll see more in a minute what that means. But let's say that this was a class library. Maybe you wanted to create a specialized kind of form that then gets used by your WinForm application. Your form itself is nothing more than a class. So you can actually store a WinForm inside of a DLL and then consume that DLL, make it a reference, and then use that form in your WinForm application. And maybe you've got 5 or 6 different WinForm applications and you want to keep that code centralized. You put it inside of that class library and then you have it in one place. User controls, that's probably an even more common case. Maybe you make this specialized type of text box that's designed to store and format phone numbers. Well, you want to put that control somewhere and then be able to reference it all over the place. Components, you can do those. You can do WPF user controls. There's an about box. They added some interesting stuff in here. ADO.NET entity models, and then you have other pieces. So if I went right click and chose add, there was an option for class. I would have given me this exact same screen. And ironically, class is the first one at the top. It will just select class for you. There's a right click and a WinForm option. When you do right click add, there's a Windows Form option. It'll give you this exact same dialog, but it selects Windows Form by default. So add item is always your cleanest, kind of most direct shot. But if you're looking for something specific and you want to save yourself a couple of clicks, you can go down here and choose Windows Form. See, same box, just picks Windows Form for you. So I'm going to pick a class. I'm going to call it student. Type in the name, hit add. .NET adds a student.cs file, or I'm sorry, Visual Studio adds a student.cs file. Class student templates it all up for me, makes it nice and simple. Now if we look at just this section of our C# file for a moment, we have 3 components that I want to make you aware of. The first piece is the using statements. In Java they were called imports, or import statements. You would import a package or you would import a class as a reference. The usings work in much the same way, but your usings don't import a single class, they're importing a namespace. Now in Java you call them packages, here we call them namespaces. Well, yeah, we'll go with that. Technically, your assemblies and your packages are the same, but the package kind of is also the name. We'll go with that. All right, so your namespace allows you to carve out a category for a set of classes that are similar. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so let's say in this application we wanted to be able to connect to a database and access the database, and we needed these components, these classes, in order to do that. We wanted to kind of put them together in a unit. Well, through Visual Studio, you right-click, you say Add Folder, and this will be our data section of our project. If I come in here and I right-click, Add Class, and I'll say this is my database utility class. What happens is that the namespace was week2_part1. Now the namespace, because it's under this data folder, becomes week2_part1.data. If I want to then use this database class, I have to put in a using statement to use the classes underneath week2_part1.data. I'm actually bringing in that entire namespace and any classes that exist underneath it, and you can think of it like a folder. It's a folder that contains classes. Just like you would organize your files on your desktop or on your Dropbox or whatever, that folder has a logical representation. It's there to organize code into segments. So you want to bring that in and use that same idea, that under .data is all the pieces that probably have to do with interfacing or working with data. There's this idea of a model. Have you guys heard the term model before in reference to programming? You have your models. Okay, models are classes. So if you create a class that represents something in the real world, those are referred to as your models. As you build out business applications, and I kind of mentioned this last week, when you look at a business case, say you're building an application that allows a student to go in and register for a course. Your models represent the physical things in that scenario. You would build a model for a student. That model class would have student first name, last name, student ID number. You would have a model class for the course. This is the course, the name of the course ID, when it meets, where it meets. You would then have a model class that represents the schedule. This schedule is owned by this student. So you can picture there's a property on the schedule object or schedule class that is a student property. And then there's another property that is a list of courses that student has signed up for. All of those models you would want to group together into a folder. Models, class, student class. I already have a student class, so I'll remove that one. So just like last week, first name, last name, student ID, forgive my casing. So then I add another class for a course. Course name, course ID, location, meeting date. So I create that class. Then I add one more model. Whoops. Add class, and this would be the schedule. So this would be the student, and this would be a list of course. So that object would represent the student that owns that schedule and the courses that student has signed up for. So I create instances of the student object, student 1, student 2. Then I create instances of courses. So that would be my catalog of courses. So I probably have an entire list of those courses. And then, if you think about a user interface, I'd have the student log in, I'd identify the student, and I'd take that student object and I'd store it in a variable somewhere in memory. I'd then load up that list of all those courses, give them a list of courses, and let them click on a course, add it to their schedule. I would then pick that course object out of the list. I would probably create a schedule object. I would then add that course to that student's schedule, and then represent it on the screen. It's in your cart, so to speak. They click another course, I grab that course object, I then add it to the list of course requests in the schedule object, and I'm working through those mechanics in that class to facilitate the physical work of this student has a schedule request form in front of them. They're actually writing down course numbers on that form. We're doing those same mechanics, but we're doing it using classes and objects and variables. Ultimately, you would take that schedule object, you would probably save it to a database and say this student requested this course, this student requested this course, this student requested this course in a table of student ID and course ID. That process that I just articulated is the process that you go through in building a line of business type application. You'll notice on the schedules class that because I created a folder called models, its namespace is week2_part1.models. And I put all of my models in that folder. So when I get back to my main application, my program.cs, my static void main, if I type in student, I get a red squiggle. That red squiggle is telling me that I don't have a direct reference to student, even though it's inside of the same project. The problem is that it's not in this namespace of week2 part 1. It's in the namespace week2 part 1.models. If I click here, I'll get this drop down, and it's going to give me these accelerators. It's giving me these options within Visual Studio. Visual Studio is trying to help me. It's trying to say, well, student exists, and it exists inside of week2_part1.models. Do you want to add a using statement to the top of this file to reference that namespace? That's one option it's giving me. The other option is I can just put I can prepend the namespace in front of that student line. Instead of bringing in that using statement, just put it in front of that one case. So a prepend looks like this. I'll just call my variable s for the moment. And that works. But the next time I want to declare a student, I got to do week2_part1.models.student. I have to do that every time I want to declare a student or have a variable that is containing a student. The other alternative is to use the using statement. And by clicking using, Visual Studio goes up to the top and then adds using week2_part1.models to the file. Then every time I say student as my type, it automatically assumes that it's that student. Which makes it a lot easier when you're typing student a whole bunch. Now, things can happen where you reference two different namespaces, that both contain a class of the same name. Either Visual Studio or the compiler will yell at you and tell you that it doesn't know which one you're referring to. At that point, that would be when you would use the explicit namespace dot class name notation in line, is to help it understand which class you're referring to, because it can't decide. Now, I know that was a lot to kind of throw at you, going from the .NET Framework to Visual Studio to getting into all of this. We will continue to visit this and revisit this and revisit this every week, because we'll be creating classes, we'll be talking about how to organize them, we'll be talking about building models and why you need to build models and going through that process. So don't feel like, he said what? And that's the end. But I want you to at least start to hear the terminology, start to see what I'm talking about, and start to build an understanding, because I may be wrong, but based on history, I have the strong impression that most of this is probably stuff that was either just skimmed over or not covered in the past courses. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Okay. So, this is stuff that you're just going to interact with, and especially once you start working in real jobs and you start looking up stuff on the internet and start asking questions, these are things that are just best practice. So knowing them will make your life loads easier moving forward.